Britain won the war, and then it had to figure out what to do with almost nothing left. In 1947, a factory in Solihull, England, a factory that had spent the war building aircraft engines instead of cars, was sitting idle. Steel was rationed, money was short, and two brothers running one of Britain's oldest car companies needed to find a way to keep their workers employed and their company alive. The solution they arrived at wasn't supposed to change the world. It was supposed to last maybe 2 or 3 years. It's been running ever since. If you watch this channel and haven't subscribed yet, this is a good moment to do it. Most of the people watching right now are doing so on television. And if that's you, please consider sharing this video with someone who loves cars or history. Sharing is one of the most important things you can do to help this channel grow and keep bringing these stories to more people. Now, back to the story. To understand why the Land Rover had to exist, you need to understand what Britain looked like in the years immediately after 1945. Victory had cost the country enormously. Factories that had spent 6 years making weapons and aircraft had to be converted back to civilian production, while the government rationed nearly everything: steel, petrol, electricity. Even food rationing continued until 1954, nearly a decade after the war ended. The government's economic strategy was blunt. Stafford Cripps, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, summed it up in a phrase that became national policy: export or die. Britain needed foreign currency to service its debts, and the automotive industry was one of the few sectors capable of generating significant export revenue quickly. By 1948, around 60% of British cars were being sent overseas. For the Rover Company, headquartered in Solihull in the West Midlands, this was both an opportunity and a crisis. Rover had started in 1878 as a bicycle manufacturer, eventually becoming a maker of quality saloon cars. Solid, dignified, the kind of vehicle a successful doctor or solicitor might drive. Not a mass-market company. A company for people who valued substance over flash. The war had interrupted everything. The Solihull plant had been built as a shadow factory, one of a network of facilities constructed in case German bombing destroyed the main industrial centers, and had spent the war producing Bristol Hercules aircraft engines. The factory emerged physically intact, but the company's car production had essentially stopped for 6 years. Spencer Wilkes, the chairman of Rover, and his brother Maurice, the chief engineer, faced a practical and existential problem. They had a factory and workers and expertise. What they lacked was enough steel to build cars in volume, and the upmarket saloons they had made before the war were not the export-generating machines the government most needed. Their first post-war passenger car, the Rover P3, was a decent vehicle, but it wasn't going to transform the company's fortunes. Something else was needed. The idea came from a farm. Maurice Wilkes owned land on the island of Anglesey, off the northwestern coast of Wales. Like many landowners and farmers in post-war Britain, he was using a vehicle that wasn't British at all. A surplus American Willys Jeep left over from the war. The Jeep had been produced in massive numbers for Allied forces. Roughly 640,000 were built during the war. And when the fighting ended, many of those vehicles found their way into civilian hands. They were cheap, available, and extraordinarily capable on rough ground. Farmers loved them. The Jeep could cross muddy fields, haul equipment, navigate tracks that would stop an ordinary car dead. Britain's countryside was full of them, but the Willys Jeep was wearing out. Replacement parts were difficult to obtain, and Maurice Wilkes found himself in a conversation with his brother about what he would do when it finally gave up. The answer, as the story has often been told, was that there was nothing suitable available in Britain. The country didn't make anything like it. That conversation became a question, and the question became a business proposition. What if Rover built a vehicle like the Jeep? Not a copy. Something better, more versatile, more useful to the farmers and workers who needed a machine that could do things a saloon car simply couldn't. A vehicle that could haul equipment, cross rough ground, tow loads, and still be driven on public roads. The idea was sketched out, reportedly on the sand at Red Wharf Bay on the Anglesey coast, In 1947, Maurice Wilkes drew the basic outline. Two brothers, a beach, and a simple question. What does Britain need that Britain isn't building? The Rover board gave cautious approval in September 1947, but the idea, at this point, was still only an idea. Building it was another matter entirely. The material problem was the first and most fundamental obstacle. Steel in post-war Britain was allocated by the government, and the biggest allocations went to manufacturers who could demonstrate the strongest export potential. A small, versatile utility vehicle for farmers wasn't obviously the kind of thing that would win large steel allocations. And even if Rover could obtain steel, working it into the complex curved body panels of a conventional car required expensive industrial presses, equipment the company didn't want to invest in for a vehicle that might only sell for a couple of years. The solution came from an unexpected source. Britain had spent the war building aircraft. Aircraft were built largely from aluminum. Lightweight, strong, far more workable than steel for aviation purposes. When the war ended, the aircraft industry contracted sharply. Suddenly, there was a surplus of aluminum alloy available, unrationed, and considerably cheaper than steel. Rover's engineers, working in what were genuinely austere conditions, with limited time and minimal tooling budget, decided to build the body of their new vehicle from aluminum, specifically from a material called bermabrite, an aluminum-magnesium alloy that could be formed with simple tools rather than requiring the massive industrial presses used for steel body panels. The flat, angular surfaces of the early Land Rover weren't a design statement. They weren't chosen because someone thought it looked purposeful or military. They were the shape aluminum could be formed into cheaply and quickly, with the tools and budget Rover had available. The body panels were literally hand-formed. The lines were straight because curves were expensive. The choice to use aluminum turned out to be one of the most consequential decisions in the vehicle's history. Not for any reason its engineers anticipated, but because aluminum doesn't rust. Decades later, Land Rovers built in 1948 and 1949 would still be found working in fields, in jungles, on mountain tracks, not just surviving but actually functioning. In 1992, Land Rover claimed that 70% of all the vehicles they had ever built were still in use. That statistic, remarkable as it sounds, was in large part a direct consequence of a material choice made because steel was rationed and expensive presses were out of reach. The chassis itself was steel, a robust box-section ladder frame, because there were some structural jobs aluminum simply couldn't do. The engine came from the Rover P3, the company's existing passenger car. The gearbox was adapted from existing Rover components. Where possible, the engineers used what was already on hand. There was no budget for developing entirely new systems from scratch. The original concept was to use an actual Willys Jeep chassis and axles as the starting point, and early prototypes did exactly that. The production vehicle moved beyond this, but the debt to the American military Jeep was acknowledged openly at the time. The first Land Rover, still just called the Land Rover, with no series designation, no generation number, debuted at the Amsterdam Motor Show on April 30th, 1948. It had an 80-inch wheelbase, a 1,595cc petrol engine producing around 50 horsepower, a price of $450. Passenger seats were optional, doors were optional. The vehicle was designed first as a working tool, and comfort was a secondary consideration at best. It was, by almost any standard, a primitive machine. The ride was rough, the interior was Spartan. Working the gear levers to engage four-wheel drive required a degree of mechanical engagement that most car drivers of the era would have found bewildering. And yet, the reaction at Amsterdam was immediately positive. Orders came in quickly. Within a year of production beginning, approximately 8,000 units had been built. The British Army placed its first order before the end of 1948. By 1950, members of the British royal family were using them. Rover had gone looking for a way to survive 2 or 3 years of post-war austerity. They had stumbled into something much larger. But here is the detail that is easy to miss. The Land Rover was not supposed to replace Rover's car business. It was supposed to sustain the factory long enough for the car business to recover. The plan, as conceived in 1947, was that the utility vehicle would be a stopgap. Something to keep the Solihull workforce employed and the export figures healthy while Rover got back on its feet making the saloon cars that were its real identity. 2, maybe 3 years. Then back to normal. What happened instead was that the Land Rover immediately outsold everything else Rover made. By the early 1950s, it was already clear that the company had not accidentally built a stopgap. They had accidentally built a product that people in many different countries, for many different reasons, needed urgently. Farmers in Britain, ranchers in Australia, explorers planning overland expeditions, colonial administrators in Africa and Asia, scientists conducting fieldwork in remote regions, the military in various countries looking for a reliable, maintainable vehicle for rough terrain. Each of these groups saw the Land Rover differently. The farmer in Wales saw a farm machine that happened to be road legal. The Australian stockman saw a truck that could cross terrain no truck had previously crossed. The British Colonial Service saw a vehicle that could reach places where proper roads didn't exist. The Army saw a Jeep replacement that could be kept running with minimal support. The Land Rover was becoming different things to different people, and all of those people were buying it. By 1951, Land Rover sales had eclipsed all of Rover's passenger car sales combined. The company that had built a farm vehicle as a commercial lifeline now found that the farm vehicle was the business. The saloon cars were the sideshow. In 1955, 6 university students, drawn from both Oxford and Cambridge, sat in a Cambridge dormitory and hatched a plan to drive overland from London to Singapore. No one had done it. No one had even seriously attempted it. The route crossed deserts, mountain ranges, some of the most remote and difficult terrain on Earth. They chose 2 Land Rovers, painted one light blue and one dark blue to represent each university, and convinced the Rover company to provide the vehicles. Against expectations, they made it. The Oxford and Cambridge Far Eastern Expedition became one of the first overland journeys of its kind, and photographs of the 2 battered, mud-caked Land Rovers arriving at their destination circulated widely. This was not the kind of advertising Rover's marketing department had planned. It was better. The Land Rover was no longer just a farmer's machine. It was becoming something else. Evidence that a vehicle built from post-war surplus and austerity engineering could go essentially anywhere on Earth. More expeditions followed. Researchers, explorers, missionaries, aid workers, and adventurers across Africa, Asia, South America, and the Middle East were discovering that the Land Rover had a peculiar quality. When it broke down, and in remote conditions, vehicles always eventually break down. It could usually be fixed by someone with basic mechanical skills, a set of simple tools, and whatever materials were locally available. The simplicity that had been born of budget constraints turned out to be exactly what was needed when you were 300 miles from the nearest spare parts supplier. Humanitarian organizations began using them. Medical missions in sub-Saharan Africa relied on them to reach villages that had no roads. Agricultural development programs in South Asia used them to transport equipment and personnel into areas where nothing else could operate. The United Nations and various international agencies began including Land Rovers in their standard operational equipment for work in difficult environments. The vehicle that Maurice Wilkes had sketched on a Welsh beach because he needed to keep a factory running had become, without anyone fully planning it, a piece of global infrastructure. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the government was taking notice. The Land Rover had become one of the country's most successful exports, exactly as the export or die policy had hoped. It was going everywhere, to Commonwealth nations, to former colonies, to agricultural economies on every continent. Countries that couldn't afford expensive European machinery found that the Land Rover was not cheap, but it was durable enough to justify its price over many years of hard use. In 1951, King George VI awarded the Land Rover a royal warrant, formal recognition that it was a supplier to the royal household. It was an unlikely distinction for what had been conceived as a farmer's utility vehicle. In the same year, The British Army began expanding its Land Rover fleet significantly, using the longer 109-inch wheelbase variants for troop transport, reconnaissance, and logistics. The vehicle's aluminum body and four-wheel drive proved valuable across the wide range of conditions British forces were then operating in, from the Middle East to Malaya to Germany. The Land Rover was by now serving simultaneously as a farm machine, a military vehicle, an expedition tool, an aid delivery platform, a colonial administration vehicle, and a scientific research support vehicle. This was extraordinary versatility for a machine that had been designed primarily as a stopgap and built from available materials. But the story was about to change again. By the early 1960s, a different kind of buyer was beginning to appear. Land Rovers had always been sold to people with practical reasons to own them. Farmers needed them to work. Explorers needed them to travel. Armies needed them to operate. The customers were defined by function. The Land Rover was a tool, and tools are bought by people who need to use them. But the 1960s were changing the relationship between consumers and their possessions across the wealthy world. Products were becoming identity statements. The generation that had grown up in the post-war era, with greater prosperity than their parents had known, was buying things not just because they needed them, but because of what those things said about who they were. The Land Rover, with its reputation for toughness and its association with adventure and exploration, began to attract a new kind of buyer. People who lived in cities, didn't own farms, and had no particular intention of crossing deserts, but who liked the idea that they could. This was a phenomenon the company hadn't engineered. It emerged from the vehicle's reputation rather than from any deliberate marketing strategy. The Land Rover's association with exploration and hardship, genuine associations earned through genuine expeditions, gave it a character that urban buyers found appealing precisely because their own lives offered so little of either. Rover's engineers saw this shift and recognized an opportunity. The original Land Rover was an excellent tool. Could it be made into something that was also a pleasant vehicle to travel in? Could the same toughness and capability be combined with the kind of comfort that would appeal to buyers who didn't need to cross rivers, but wouldn't mind being able to? The answer, after several years of development, was the Range Rover. The Range Rover was unveiled on June 17, 1970, in Cornwall. A choice that was itself meaningful. The rugged southwestern tip of England providing an appropriate backdrop for a vehicle that claimed to combine serious capability with serious refinement. The man most responsible for its engineering was Charles Spencer King, known within Rover as Spen King, who happened to be the nephew of Maurice Wilkes. The family connection was almost too neat, but the engineering relationship was real. Spen King had joined Rover as an engineer and had become convinced that the existing Land Rover, excellent as it was leaving a market entirely unserved. His vision was specific, a vehicle that could cross the Darien Gap, the notoriously impassable stretch of jungle and swamp between Colombia and Panama, where the Pan-American Highway simply stops, but could also drive comfortably on the motorway from London to Edinburgh. Not a compromise between the two, but genuinely capable of both. The technical solutions that made this possible were significant. The Range Rover used coil spring suspension rather than the leaf springs of the series Land Rover, a change that dramatically improved ride quality on paved roads without sacrificing off-road articulation. It had permanent four-wheel drive rather than the switchable system of the original. Disc brakes on all four wheels. The interior was a departure from everything that had come before. The original Land Rover had seats that could charitably be described as functional. The Range Rover had a cabin that, while not luxurious by the standards of a Rolls-Royce, was recognizably comfortable. Properly upholstered seats, reasonable soundproofing, a dashboard that acknowledged the existence of the driver as a human being rather than simply an operator of equipment. The reaction from the press was strongly positive. The Autocar, one of Britain's most respected automotive publications, wrote that the Range Rover had fulfilled and even surpassed the high hopes held for it. Then, something happened that nobody at Rover had anticipated. The Louvre Museum in Paris declared the Range Rover an exemplary work of industrial design and put it on display. In 1971, the year after its launch, the first car ever exhibited as art in the Louvre was a utilitarian four-wheel drive vehicle built by a company in the English Midlands that had started making bicycles. This was not a planned marketing event. It was a genuine cultural institution making a genuine aesthetic judgment. The Range Rover's clean, functional lines, developed by engineers trying to solve practical problems, had produced something that curators in Paris considered worthy of standing alongside paintings and sculptures. For the Land Rover story, it was one of the most remarkable moments of transformation. A vehicle line that had begun as a farm utility, evolved into expedition equipment, and expanded into the military and humanitarian world, had now been recognized as a work of design. The Range Rover's capability credentials were tested in ways that went far beyond museum exhibitions. In late 1971, a British Army team from the 17th the 21st Lancers, led by explorer John Blashford Snell, set out from Anchorage, Alaska. Their destination was Tierra del Fuego at the southern tip of Argentina. The journey was approximately 18,000 miles. For most of it, roads existed. For one section, they did not. The Darien Gap, the 250 miles of dense jungle and swamp between Colombia and Panama that breaks the continuity of the Pan-American Highway, had never been crossed by any wheeled vehicle. The terrain was considered, by most assessments, impassable. The team took 2 Range Rovers. After a grueling 6 months, including 99 days to cover those 250 miles of Darien jungle, winching vehicles through mud, building temporary bridges, and navigating terrain that often required the vehicles to be carried as much as driven, they reached Tierra del Fuego. The expedition had been completed. The Darien Gap had been crossed in vehicles for the first time. In 1974, a Range Rover completed a 7,500-mile traverse of the Sahara Desert from west to east in 100 days. 3 years later, a modified Range Rover won the four-wheel drive class in the London to Sydney Marathon, one of the most demanding long-distance events in motorsport history. These were not laboratory tests. They were not press demonstrations. They were genuine expeditions and genuine competitions, and the Range Rover performed in all of them in ways that proved the vehicle's capabilities beyond any reasonable argument. From 1981 onward, a competition called the Camel Trophy took this reputation further still. The event partnered with Land Rover from 1981 to 1998, sending international teams into some of the most extreme terrain on Earth: Sumatra, Papua New Guinea, Zaire, Siberia, Madagascar. In Land Rovers painted a distinctive sand glow yellow. Over nearly 2 decades, 566 participants from 35 countries competed. The images generated, vehicles winching through chest-deep rivers, navigating jungle tracks that barely deserved the name, became the defining visual language of serious off-road driving. And the vehicles weren't prototypes. They were production line Land Rovers, prepared but not fundamentally rebuilt. When teams emerged from 3 weeks of jungle, driving with vehicles damaged but still running, it said something about the engineering that no marketing campaign could have replicated. Back in Britain, the company's ownership was becoming complicated. The Rover Company was absorbed into the British Leyland Motor Corporation in 1967. British Leyland became notorious through the 1970s for industrial disputes and financial crises requiring repeated government bailouts. Through all of it, Land Rover remained one of the few consistently profitable elements within the group. The vehicles kept selling. The military kept ordering. The export markets kept growing, exactly as the export or die policy had originally hoped they would. In 1978, Land Rover was formally separated from the Rover car brand and given its own identity within British Leyland. Belated recognition of how completely it had outgrown its origins. The Defender, as it would eventually be called, continued the lineage begun in 1948. Aluminum body, ladder chassis, the same essential philosophy. And alongside it, the Range Rover was attracting a buyer nobody had originally planned for. By the 1980s, the Range Rover had 4 doors, power steering, air conditioning, and an automatic gearbox. These were not features designed for farmers. They were features designed for buyers in London, New York, and Tokyo who wanted a vehicle associated with capability and adventure without needing those qualities in their daily lives. The urban professional, the wealthy buyer who valued what the Land Rover represented rather than what it could actually do. Charles Spencer King, who had engineered the original Range Rover, had built a vehicle intended to go anywhere. What he had not anticipated was a market of buyers who had nowhere particularly challenging to go, but wanted very much to own the vehicle anyway. British Leyland sold Land Rover to British Aerospace in 1988. British Aerospace sold it to BMW in 1994. BMW sold it to Ford in 2000. In 2008, Ford sold it, along with Jaguar, to Tata Motors of India for approximately $2.3 billion. The response in Britain was skeptical. A vehicle so associated with British identity, sold to an Indian conglomerate best known for commercial trucks. What happened instead was that under Tata's ownership, Jaguar Land Rover, the combined entity formalized in 2013, invested heavily, expanded its model range, and grew from roughly 250,000 vehicles annually to well over 600,000. The Range Rover line became Britain's largest luxury car export. The Defender was eventually retired and relaunched in 2019 with its essential character intact, meeting modern standards while carrying the original's DNA. The company that had been passed between 4 owners in 14 years was now generating more revenue than it had at almost any point in its history. Under Indian ownership, still building vehicles in Solihull, in the same factory where the post-war austerity vehicle had first taken shape. Today, when you see a Land Rover on a city street, and in many cities across the world, you will see them constantly. What you are actually seeing is one of the more unusual industrial survival stories of the 20th century. A vehicle that was not supposed to outlast the austerity of 1940s Britain. A stopgap measure that became a permanent institution. A farm machine that was recognized as art. A soldier's transport that became a symbol of status. A product of scarcity that became a product of aspiration. The aluminum body that was chosen because steel was rationed became the feature that kept vehicles running for decades. The simple, maintainable engineering that was a consequence of a limited budget became the reason aid organizations trusted it in the most remote places on Earth. The military credibility that came from genuine hard service in genuine difficult conditions became the foundation of an image that eventually attracted buyers who would never see difficult conditions at all. Maurice Wilks sketched the outline of a vehicle on a beach in Anglesey, Wales, because his company needed to survive and the country needed exports, and there was nothing quite like it being built in Britain. The sketched outline became a prototype, the prototype became a product, and the product became something that crossed the Darien Gap, delivered medicine to villages in Africa, explored the length of the Asian continent, and was put on display in the Louvre. And then, through a transformation that nobody planned and that would have seemed entirely implausible to anyone watching that first silver-painted vehicle roll off the Solihull production line in 1948, it ended up parked outside restaurants and offices and private schools across the wealthiest postcodes of the world. The vehicle that Britain built because it had almost nothing left became one of the things it's best known for having. The farmers who first bought it could not have imagined where it would eventually park. And the urban buyers who park it there today probably have no idea what it was originally built for, or how close it came to being only a stopgap that lasted a few seasons before the real cars came back. That is the Land Rover's greatest irony, and perhaps its greatest achievement, that it became necessary in so many different ways, to so many different people, for so many different reasons, that the question of what it actually was became almost impossible to answer simply. It was a British farm machine. It was a military vehicle. It was an explorer's tool. It was a humanitarian lifeline. It was a work of industrial art. It was a status symbol. It was a survivor. It was all of these things because in 1947, 2 brothers needed to keep a factory running. And the Land Rover wasn't the only machine to emerge from post-war necessity, with consequences nobody predicted. In the same years that Britain was scrapping together aluminum panels in Solihull, a very different kind of crisis, one that would unfold not in fields and factories, but in a conflict that briefly threatened to cut off the fuel that ran every car in Europe, was already brewing in the Middle East. That crisis would produce a car that, like the Land Rover, looked at first like a practical response to an immediate problem. It would become one of the most famous small cars ever built. That story is next.